this second presentation will be equally as great. So you all are definitely in for a treat. I'm sorry about the heat. I don't control that. I wish that I did, because it's always cold in this room. But it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Odis Johnson, who is the Associate Chair and Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of Education and Associate Professor of Education and Sociology at Washington University in St. Louis. Before that appointment, he was the Chair and Associate Professor here in the African American Studies Department. Dr. Johnson's research examines how neighborhoods, schools, and public policies relate to social inequality, youth development, and the status of African American populations. His work on these topics has earned him a National Academies Ford Foundation Dissertation Fellowship, for which was the first one earned by someone in the field of education. This is an extremely competitive competition. He was also awarded the 2013 Outstanding Review of Research Award from the American Education Research Association, which is the leading professional association of educational research. He has obtained several grants from several different funding agencies. He also serves on the editorial board for Review of Educational Research and the Urban Review, frequently makes appearances in media outlets, and serves as an advisor to government agencies and school systems, including several in this particular local area and around the country. And personally, I just want to say he is a good friend of mine and has also been a great mentor for me throughout my development here at the University of Maryland. So it's a pleasure to have him speaking back here in Maryland, and a pleasure to have him in my class.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and it is wonderful to be back. I can't say enough about my colleagues, Dr. Mahmoudi and Dr. Ray, and you will remain my colleagues, though I'm at Washington University. I'm going to first fast forward here to my slides. Pedro, you had a lot of slides. How long were you? Okay. So while Dr. Noguera's talk has really gotten into a lot of specifics of educational policy, my talk is going to be more broad, and we're going to really get into this idea of race and the racism of avoidance. And so with that, I'm just going to go move forward quite quickly, because I know that class is over at 3:15, correct? Okay, and louder. Okay, sorry about that. So I recently participated in the Race, Poverty, and Change in America Symposium.
A little higher.
Is that good? Good. You can hear me now? Okay. I recently participated in the Race, Poverty, and Change Symposium at University of Pennsylvania. And one of the participants, Dr. James Anderson, remarked that one of the great social mysteries of the 20th century is that the achievement gap at one point was converging, and then it stopped. And that mystery remains unexplained. For some reason, this convergence started in about 1970, an astonishing rate that would have eliminated the reading gap in just 25 years. And just some decades longer, the math gap would have also been eliminated. But in the 1990s, progress toward test score equality stopped. So let me do this here. As shown in this trend here, this chart, we can see that the black-white achievement gap, and also I've included Hispanics here, but the largest disparities are between blacks and whites, declined from 31 points to basically 21 points by 1988. And that's a reduction of about 30%. And from 80 to 88, and has grown since that time. Convergence was even stronger among 17-year-olds, narrowing by half even as white test scores gained. But this too stopped in 88. NAEP math data show the same type of convergence, the same patterns. It reduced by 41% for those who are age 13, and by roughly 48% for those who are age 17 by 1990. But since that time, it's remained at around 29 to 26 points respectively for each age group. While scholars and practitioners alike would like us to discredit tests altogether as culturally biased, and that might also be true, it is also true that the longitudinal assessments from 1970 to 1990 all have shown test score convergence. So 25 years later, research has explained neither why convergence stopped nor why it happened in the first place. Hence, policymakers wanted No Child Left Behind to do something that they did not yet understand. And perhaps that is why No Child Left Behind did not achieve its mark. So this talk gives me an opportunity not only to address the test score mystery, but also to assess the ability of macro-sociological theories to explain and survive the evidence, to address the enduring problem of race in the U.S., and then also to move toward a new understanding of inequality. This new understanding of inequality can be summarized as follows. The race-related school selection that school desegregation encouraged explains not only the convergence and stagnation of the test score gap, but also changes within the racial and economic structure of the metropolis. And I will end with some comments about what I'm calling racism of avoidance. But before I explain why I believe this to be true, I should address why I believe other explanations are not. The reason is because they are grossly inconsistent with demographic trends in education. The first of these theories argues that neighborhood racial segregation leads to oppositional orientations among African Americans, cultural isolation, which then leads to the use of Black English, among other behaviors that we find inconsistent with learning in school. But as this chart shows, at the top, neighborhood racial segregation measured here as between track dissimilarity. That means the percentage of individuals that would need to change places in order to achieve an even racial distribution across census tracts. It reached its height in the decade in which test scores began to converge and historic lows as test scores ended up declining. So I've included at the bottom the trends in actual exposure, and this is measured as within tract residency. So the likelihood that individuals will actually encounter each other within their residential areas, which as you can see changed little, probably too little, to explain dramatic changes in test outcomes. Furthermore, my own research and empirical work has shown that the connection between the neighborhood's racial composition and learning outcomes is at best inconsistent. So I've concluded that neighborhood racial segregation is not up to the task of explaining why we had convergence and then why that convergence stopped. I also question the extent to which economic progress is an explanation, primarily the growth in the Black middle class and the war on poverty. Now, it is true that NAEP gains from 78 to 90 occurred for all social classes, measured here in parents' education, but most amazing is that the convergence was greatest among African Americans whose parents had not finished high school. So here you see at the bottom, with post-high school education, that gap is 34 points. It declines in 1990 to 16 points. But among those whose parents did not finish high school, it was at 28 points and declined all the way to 9 points. So Black and white test scores were converging between families of different educational levels and within the same social classes. The same can be said of another important indicator, the dropout rate. The dropout rate for African Americans fell from 28% in 1970 to 15% in 1988. It declined more among children whose parents had not completed high school and then among children with better educated parents, and the dropout rate declined more among Blacks than among whites whose parents had the same amount of education. These social class convergences have prompted some to argue that economic gains related to the war on poverty and growth of the middle class made a positive difference, and that might be the case, but there are some inconsistencies. Yes, the black middle class grew during the period of convergence, but only in absolute numbers. The fact is that African Americans in the middle class ceased growing as a proportion of that race's total population at around 1980. Still unexplained by black middle class research is what occurred among that population after 1990 that would end test score convergence. Furthermore, the 6.4% black unemployment rate that was achieved immediately after the war on poverty programs, around in 1969, 1970, it was short-lived. And by 1972, unemployment had reached 10% and remained in the double digits throughout the 70s, the same decade in which we witnessed dramatic declines in test score differences. So while there were other war on poverty programs that targeted children directly, such as Head Start, a lot of the research has suggested that those impacts did not last beyond grade 3, that the benefit of participation did not last long. So I have concluded that economic progress theories in and of themselves, maybe in isolation here, but definitely seem not adequate enough to explain this dramatic decline and then stagnation in test score convergence. But perhaps most inconsistent with test score trends is Wilson's joblessness-inspired neighborhood disorganization theory, which implied the outmigration of black middle class left few neighbors with normative culture within black neighborhoods to serve as role models and examples of educational success, that concentration effects arose due to the growth of poverty in their neighborhoods, and a social dysfunction set in that made these places centers of drug, crime, and gang activity. But while Wilson's test score, while these things were occurring, you also have to consider that test scores were actually converging according to residency. So here we have the test score differences for those in advantaged urban places versus disadvantaged urban places. And we find that the advantaged population actually gained in terms of their percent proficient and then their actual proficiency score. And that gain was quite significant from 52 points, which was the difference, for age 13 and 48 points at age 17, it declined to 30 and 32 points, respectively. So the bottom line here is that as these changes were happening in urban contexts, there actually was test score convergence happening there as well. So not to belabor this point, because I could go into educational resource trends and also trends in social optimism, it would yield more inconsistencies. So I'll just summarize here. The black-white test score gap converged within social classes, between social classes, among multiple academic subjects, in graduation rates, and between advantaged and disadvantaged neighborhoods, suggesting that the nation had, from 1970 to 1990, the highest achieving black and disadvantaged children it ever had relative to other groups. And no macro-sociological theory can explain why. So, he's waving at me, so I'm waving back. So, I am going to offer my own critique here. I want to say that a more fitting explanation, more fitting of the available evidence, should note that, here the first answer, desegregation and resegregation of schools coincides with the convergence and stagnation of the gap. While the numbers on this table may not be easy to read, reading isn't essential in order to get the gist of it. It details the percentage of white students in schools attended by the average black student within states with African American populations that are greater than 5%, By this measure, desegregation increased from 1970 to 1980 in 26 out of 30 states, so we were making progress. But as seen in this highlighted column here, between 1990 and 2003, all but one state declined in integration. And 20 of those states highlighted in yellow lost altogether their previous gains in racial integration. These changes were not merely a product of market-induced selection. Research shows that the exodus of whites followed the implementation of desegregation plans. Within 2 years, there was a 20% change, and I want to say some years later, up to 30% of the actual gains in integration were totally lost following the implementation of desegregation. Sprawl patterns suggest whites were settling new areas at a rate that outpaced growth in population density, which suggests tighter housing markets were not motivating these moves as much as racial avoidance. This new perspective concludes first that while Massey and Denton were correct in that race was an issue, they erred in locating this influence in neighborhoods. It should have been located in schools where we were finding the greatest racial transformation taking place. And second, that the significance of race had not declined, as Wilson had suggested. Rather, its influence has shifted to a social unit with an organizing power that urban sociologists had yet to take into scale. So a necessary part of this explanation requires us to consider that the racial transformation of city schools spurred family flight that shaped the economic and racial organization of metropolitan areas. The number of two-parent families with children fell by 1.5 million in the inner cities from 1970 to 1990, and increased in the suburbs by 1.3 million. And one of the main reasons why the families gave for this relocation was school quality. So educational opportunity was among the top two reasons. The other was school safety. I want to point out, though, if families with children seeking quality education had not left these areas, their former neighborhoods would not have become areas of concentrated poverty for African Americans, even if the spatial and skills mismatches had affected African Americans the way that Wilson says. So I've concluded that concentrated poverty arises when good schools disappear, not necessarily when work disappears. And yes, good schools means higher resourced white schools, since the average white child attends a school now that is 78% white. They are the most segregated group, not African Americans. But while this story might be about, the majority of it being about white residential privilege, among no other group during this era was the quest for good schools more evident than among African Americans. From 1970 to 1990, the neighborhood sorting index increased by 41% for African Americans, while it only increased by 21% for whites and 27% for Hispanics. That means that African Americans who were able to leave and had the income to move were actually moving at a greater pace away from those who were lower income than other racial groups. This aided test score convergence for well-off African Americans. However, the concentration of economic advantage that followed race-related family flight ended up fortifying neighborhoods and schools in a way that prohibited later waves of migration to actually take advantage. This is a key point because while Wilson was bringing attention to the doubling of poverty in black neighborhoods from 70 to 90, the concentration of poverty was actually being outpaced by the concentration of affluence in white neighborhoods. In sum, declining residential and school attainment had to have a chilling effect on test score convergence. So I will move on to this whole idea of the racism of avoidance. And I want you to recall that southern states were integrated during at least at the neighborhood level. Southern states had some higher levels of neighborhood integration during the Jim Crow era because whites were assured that within public spaces and institutions, there would be separate accommodations, separate schooling, separate cemeteries even, which would keep their kids away from black and brown kids. It is no coincidence then that as schools have become more integrated, we've actually seen declines in neighborhood level segregation. So new Jim Crow schools now allow for greater neighborhood level integration. Therefore, racial ghettos are no longer needed to reproduce these racial status quos as long as racially segregated schools are around. So I will leave you with just a few concluding thoughts about the racism of avoidance, as I believe it is fundamental to an understanding of structural racism. First, desegregation studies suggest there were no losers. White test scores were never vulnerable to desegregation implementation, and some very high-performing schools, such as Shaker Heights, as a matter of fact, Roosevelt High School, though there's internal stratification, they nonetheless maintain a greater level of integration than the average school. Segregation, in contrast, in its most sinister racial function, gathers together the maximum number of students of color to experience the same systematic inequalities. On this point, the early childhood longitudinal study shows that the average school that black children attend rates lower on all 14 school resource measures that it assesses, including class size, teacher expectations, and even advanced curricula, or access to advanced curricula. Also, the racism of avoidance sets up a political economy where the advantaged have no stake in the game and are not compelled to insist on social change. We should all be alarmed that 3 weeks ago, the U.S. Department of Education revealed that the poor are now the majority in public schools, U.S. public schools. This was predictable because federal policies have in the past aided this race-related selection into schools at the neighborhood level, but it has done so recently within schools and really primarily through school choice policies. Releasing families through local attendance mandates has actually allowed people to exercise their race-based choices. So I will stop there, but I want to say that, yes, there is a way forward, but to think that we can have one structure of opportunity and two educational systems is just not conducive to that way forward. We're at some point going to need to get to our more fundamental problems with race and race avoidance. There's no way forward that does not include some type of racial transformation and racial reconciliation. There are no educational policies that are going to work within the current racial climate. I'm not saying that black kids can only learn when white kids are around. But what I am saying is that there is one opportunity structure, and the way in which children are prepared to meet the demands of that opportunity structure requires that we educate them in a similar way. Right now we have vast inequalities between two separate and unequal systems. So I'll just leave it there, and hopefully we'll have a great question and answer period. Thank you.